Pilot to crew, stand by for takeoff. Today's mission of the Combat Air Crew's Preservation Radio Hour will profile the experiences of B-17 Flying Fortress pilot Dwight Olson in his own words. So buckle up and hang on, we're number one for takeoff. Chapter 1, The Recruiter, Taking the Pilot's Exam.
Well, he says there's a test that you can take if you wish. That's an 8-hour test. And he says if you pass that, he says that's a 2-year equivalency test for college. And he says with that, then I can get you into pilot training. And I just barely passed it, but it took the whole 8 hours to take. And from there, I went into pilot training, and most of my training was in Texas, excepting when we got into 17s, and that was up in Tennessee.
Chapter 2, Cadet Olson's first solo.
Okay, when I soloed, I had watched a lot of the guys, and they had, if they came in the first time and got cold feet, well, you practically had to shoot them down in order to get them. And so I made up my mind I was going in the first time. Well, I came in and I was just a little bit faster than I should have been. So I had to use just a little bit of brakes at the other end of the runway. And my instructor come flying down in the Jeep and jumped up on the wing, and he says, hey, I thought a Swede could do better than that. Now he says, take her around and show me a good one. Well, the second one was no problem at all. And of course, we had a little deal going that whenever somebody sold, they'd take them and throw them in the shower, clothes and all, whatever they sold in. But one of their guys in our barracks was kind of a hotshot guy, and he went to work and dressed up in his best clothes and a scarf around his neck and the whole works when he sold. Then he came back to the barracks and put his old clothes on. Well, the guys had seen him, so they knew what the deal, so they threw him in the shower with his clothes, and then they went to his locker and got his good clothes and threw them in there too. So that was a ritual that we went through.
Chapter 3, First Impressions of the B-17 Flying Fortress.
Well, I tell you, it was overwhelming because it was such a beautiful bird. And it was a really beautiful airplane to fly because it was quite forgiving. If you did make some little error, it wasn't going to get upset about it. And it was extremely strong because it came back, well, in our flying over there, we had 50% or more of the time we had holes in our airplane. Maybe not a lot, but every now and then you'd get some pretty good holes. One day I seen a mortar shell, an aircraft shell, explode between the engines. And the reason that I knew that was the center of the explosion is I could see the red ball in the center. And I thought, oh, there goes our 2 engines. Well, I was surprised nothing happened. And when I got down, I looked at the engines and I couldn't believe the few holes that were in there. So I started asking questions. Now, why didn't it tear the engines to pieces? And they explained that the explosion goes up. And so that's why, even though I seen the thing go off in between the engines, it didn't actually really do much damage at all. Now, I got hit one time by a piece of flak, came through the upper window, and it hit me on the shoulder. But we had flak suits that went down in the front and down between our legs. And the back of the seat and the bottom was armor plate. So that piece came through and it just swallowed the daylights out of me. Then it went back out through the fuselage someplace. And if I hadn't had the flak suit on, I wouldn't be here, because it would have torn my shoulder up and there'd have been no way to stop the blood.
Chapter 4, Foggia, Italy, the town, the base, and the United States Army Air Force retaliation.
Foggia was a very big town in Italy. It was about halfway up the boot, and we were stationed about 6 miles, 7 miles north of Foggia. And the first crew that bailed out over Foggia went to work and got captured by the Italians, and they tortured them and eventually hung them from the balconies in Foggia. And so in retaliation, the fighters come in and they lined up, and each one of them taking a street north-south, and as soon as they got through strafing everybody in the street, another row of fighters came along from the east and west and went down those streets, and they kept us up until they had killed thousands of Italians. You see, the Army would come along and they'd take a town and then they'd go on, same way as happening today. Then when we came in, we had to retake the town. The same thing happened in Chernobyl, which was about 6 miles north of our camp. The first crew that went in there on Liberty was captured and hung from the town square. And the guys took an upper local turret from scrap B-17 and put it in the back of a GI truck. And then with a couple guys in Thompsons, they went in and they shot the town up. And so after that, they were fairly safe to go in, but you better watch your back, because you never know.
Chapter 5, Life on an Airbase in Italy versus England.
Well, I didn't realize the differences between England and Italy until one of the guys had his adopted son send him some stuff, and I got to talking to him. And in England, see, when they landed, they were in friendly territory because they could leave their airplanes and didn't have to worry about them. In Italy, we were in enemy territory, a former enemy, and we had to have our gunners stand guard in the airplanes at night, because the Italians or German sympathizers were always trying to get at our airplanes. And one morning, when the guard was relieved, they asked him how things had gone. He said, well, last night, he says, there was a noise over in those weeds over there. He says, I sprayed it with my carbine. Well, they went over there, and there was a dead Italian. He had a whole slug of different explosives that he was going to put on the airplanes. So this was the problem. Any time that I went into town, except the first time, the first time I learned that I always stuck my 45 under my belt and pulled my jacket down over it. It was against the rules, but I always had that 45 loaded, and because I didn't feel safe. There was two majors that were walking across pasture back to their airfield, and a group of Italian soldiers, or not soldiers, guys, jumped him and were going to knife him. They had knives and so on. And as luck would have it, colored GI was driving by in his big truck, and he looked out and he seen what was happening out in the field there. And so he stopped the truck and pulled a 45 out from underneath his seat, and he proceeded to shoot 5 of the Italians, and the rest of them, of course, disappeared quickly, you know. But then he just waved to the guys and took off, because he wasn't supposed to have that 45 either. It was a bad situation because we didn't know who we could trust. And you didn't want to walk into some of the alleys alone. And in order to get around, we would hitchhike rides on GI trucks or any of them that were going on the road. And I used to go down 40 miles to see my high school buddy and spend the day with him when I wasn't flying sometimes. But anytime I went into town, I always had the 45 with me.
Chapter 6, Sabotage from Within.
We had one B-24 outfit that they were south of us a ways. They lost 10 airplanes that when the wheel would come up, it would blow the wing off, and of course, at low altitude, everybody would be killed. And so there was all these guys from the 10 airplanes killed. There was 100 guys. And when they caught the crew chief that was doing it, the Germans had promised him $1,000 an airplane. And well, after the fact, they checked up and they found out the Germans had paid him $1,000 on the first airplane, but he hadn't been paid for any of the rest. But when they caught him, they didn't even bring him into or anything. They just machine gunned him until there wasn't anything left of him. The guys were so terribly hurt by the whole thing to think it was one of their own people that had done this. It was a tremendous blow to their pride, you know. This is the only case that I know of where one of our guys turned against us and worked for the Germans.
Chapter 7, Spies in Their Midst.
One day, Axis Sally came on the radio and she says, "Hey, you officers in the 353rd Bomb Squadron, the 301st Bomb Group, you know, if you'll look behind your bar at the clock, you'll find it's 5 minutes slow." And everybody looked at the wristwatch. It was 5 minutes slow. But the bartender was an Italian that had been an anti-aircraft gunner. And of course, he was just working for us. But the German intelligence was something else. They could manipulate things and so on.
The fate of the bartender.
They more or less laughed it off because there was nothing he could do, nothing. Most of the guys thought he was okay, you know. But it was just, it was a German setup. And this is the thing, you didn't know who was your friend or who was your foe. While in England, they knew who was friend and who was foe.
Chapter 8, The Homemade Tent Heater.
In our deal, we had tents with 5-gallon cans made into stoves, and we would drip gasoline in them by the use of a piece of copper tubing and a clothespin with a bolt drilled through the far end, and that was our regulator. And by having a thing, it was a fine threaded screw that they put through there, so you just give it a little nudge one way or the other, and this 100 octane gasoline, the same as we burned in the airplane, we carried it from the flight line. I don't imagine they had much of other gasolines there, except maybe some for the motor pool, but we had most of the 100 octane, and we had to carry it from the flight line. But we'd put it in the barrel and then siphon it directly into the stove, gravity feed. So it took the chill off of things.
Chapter 9, The Crew Chief, Whiskey, and the Homemade Radio.
Before we went over, why, we had a lot of guys coming back. And so we asked them, hey, what's the most important thing over there? And to a man they said, well, the most important thing was to treat your crew chief, your mechanic, in other words, with the utmost, because he was the man that made sure your airplane came back if possible. And the second thing they said was that money was worthless. Okay, then we asked them, well, what is worthless, or more, worth something? And they said, well, there's nothing that's better than the good old American whiskey. And, well, I'm a teetotaler, but I went down and I bought a couple bottles, one of 7 Crown and one of 4 Roses, excuse me, and I put them in my B4 bag. And we were all ready to get on board the boat when they said, oh, hey, we're gonna have a baggage inspection. Uh-oh. Well, we had slept on the bunks the night before and we had the mattresses rolled up on the end of the bunk. So I hurried up and I slipped the 2 bottles out and shoved them in the center of the mattress. And the inspector came along and looked at mine, and as soon as he was gone, I put them back. Well, then one day over there, navigator and I decided, hey, it'd be kind of nice to listen to Axe to Sally. And we were talking to some of the guys, and they said, well, okay, maybe I think you can get one radio made at the Signal Corps. So I went down there and I went in and asked for the man in charge, and it was a captain, and I went up to his desk and he said, well, Lieutenant, what can I do for you? And I said, well, I heard there's a possibility of getting a radio made out of some of the scrap parts. Oh, he says, Lieutenant, you sure heard it wrong. He says, there's no possibility. And I said, well, I had something I'd trade for it. And he says, what's that? And I opened up the newspaper that I had rolled around the 4 Roses and showed him the label. And his eyes bugged out, and he pulled open his desk drawer and shoved it in to come back Thursday. Well, They had made a little radio, but there was no speakers in our equipment. So in order to overcome that and make a speaker, they took a headphone apart, and in those days, the diaphragm in the headphone was made out of metal. And they soldered a wire to it and then brought it out into a paper cone that they shellacked. And believe it or not, it worked pretty good. We were able to listen to Axis Sally. Now, the Germans had a bad deal going. They would go to work and bomb or torpedo a ship or something, and they wouldn't fish the guys out of the water, but they'd fish the mailbags out. And so then they'd go through the mailbags, and maybe some guy's wife had wrote to him and said, hey, guess who I ran into the other day in town? And she'd name off Bud Smith or whatever. And so then Axis Sally would come along, and she'd say, Frank Jones, 353rd Bomb Squadron or whatever, battalion they were, and she said, do you know who your wife is shagging up with these days? And so she'd name this guy, and of course, some of the guys would believe it. And they just went off the deep end and would usually go wild with the until they got killed in anyhow, they'd go over and they'd shoot at every German until somebody got them.
Chapter 10, Pranks and Paybacks.
You know, when we were over there, we had to usually get up about anywhere from 4:30 in the morning. So our sleep really meant an awful lot to us. And but when we weren't flying, our time was our own. And you could do whichever you wanted to. You could go in town or whatever. And so we had one guy there that he would go to town and get drunk. Then he'd come home and he'd sneak into the orderly room and get on the PA system about 1 o'clock in the morning and say, hey, you guys, you're gonna have to get up pretty soon now. Well, we knew that only too well. But then he would sing. And he was no singer, I'll guarantee you. But the second time it happened, I decided, hey, if it ever happens again, I'm going to do something about it. So I took and pulled the lead out of a 45 shell, and I built up a large wax bullet out of hard candle wax. Put a piece of cardboard over the powder so it wouldn't melt the thing as it went out. Then I hand fed it into my 45. And it wasn't too long before he pulled it the third time. And so I waited until I heard him stumble by the tent. And I stepped out, and it was a bright moonlight night. And I let him get about 30 feet away, and I aimed at his rear and let him have it. And of course, a shell that goes off like that is just as loud as a regular 45. But he let out a yelp and took off running. And so the next day, I happened to see the back of him. He had a 3-inch wax spot on the back pocket where I'd hit him. I was surprised it was as accurate as it was. But I'll tell you, he never sang again. I never did see his face or anything, and I didn't care. But I did know that I hit him.
Chapter 11, Pilot Skills.
We tried to keep busy flying as tight a formation as possible. And so you had to more or less concentrate on your flying. And in our case, we flew as close as possible. We could even get the wings almost inside. Because it was much easier to fly the 17 at a very close radius because you could make corrections very easily. Well, if you got a little further out, then you got a little bit sloppy because you couldn't judge exactly where you were at. One day, we were dropping fragmentation bombs, and I was flying. See, we had 3 planes, 1, 2, 3, and then a second set of 3, and a tail end Charlie. Well, I was leading the second set of 3, and I was tucked up underneath the belly of the plane when George tapped me on the shoulder and done this. Well, when he did that, I knew that they were opening the bomb bay door, so I throttled back, and just as I got throttled back, the whole load of fragmentation bombs dropped out, and if I'd have been up where I was a minute before, why, I'd have probably blown half of the airplanes out of the sky, because there was 360 of those fragmentation bombs in a bomb bay. They were about 2 inches in diameter and 3 feet long. And they were tied in bundles, and when they hit the slipstream, they broke up, and so they scattered. When we hit went to help the front lines, they shot flak up to 10,000 feet to mark where the front line was, because all we could see below was just trees and more trees and so on. We had no idea where they were. And so then we'd go in and we'd drop these fragmentation bombs just beyond where the markers were, and then the guys would go through and very little resistance. We also used them on a depot in northern Italy where the Germans brought troops, supplies, and material into this big depot in northern Italy through the Alps. And so we hit them on Monday with, I don't know how many groups of planes, but they went in and they hit them. And the Germans figured, oh, well, now they hit us on Monday, they won't hit us 2 days in a row. So they moved more fresh troops and stuff in there on Tuesday, and we hit them on Tuesday. Then we laid off on Wednesday, and we went back on Thursday, and after that, the Italian campaign folded because there was no more reserves to send to the front lines or anything. And it was a real bad situation as far as the Germans were concerned, you know.
Chapter 12, Emergency Preparedness.
Well, the pilots had it probably the worst, because we had the chest chutes, we had a harness on, and the buckles were right here on our chest. But we couldn't have the parachute on when we were flying. So consequently, we put them in underneath the seat. And that meant that if you were going to bail out, you had to reach underneath the seat and pull that thing and snap it on. They had to remember. Some of the guys didn't remember. And of course, they didn't have to worry. But They used to, before I went to school there, they used to make the guys bail out once. But too many of the guys were breaking an ankle or something like that. So they said, well, if you have to bail out, you'll bail out and take your chances. So there was really no training in the procedure excepting what they told us verbally. And I never bailed out, and I was glad of it.
Chapter 13, Seeing Friends Go Down.
You tried not to think about it, but you felt sorry for the guys going through it because really the poor guys, see, the pilot and the co-pilot would be the last ones normally to go. And so it was a situation that you tried to keep away from thinking about. It was a pretty sad time when you knew buddies were no longer coming back. And but there was an awful lot of guys in our squadron even, and so we never really knew very many of them personally. You'd see them around and that was it, but you didn't get to know them like your own crew or two or three other crews, and that was about it. I guess I was lucky in that we didn't have any real close friends that went down that way, except Sandy, of course.
Chapter 14, The Fate of Downed Airmen and POWs.
In Italy, it wasn't too good because well, I really don't know too much about the Italian camps, but I do know that in Germany they treated the guys pretty rough. They had a real bad habit, which of course was to their gain, was that they would put a prisoner of war camp right next to an installation that we might want to bomb. So that way we had to do very precision bombing if we were going to keep from killing our own guys. Germans were real bad that way, and they forced a lot of the guys on marches when the war was ending and so on.
Chapter 15, Identifying Targets versus Flying the B-17.
I got copies of some of the bomb strikes that we'd made, and they had cut the captions off them for some unknown reason. I don't know what difference it really made, but so I sent him to Bombardier to see if he could identify any of them, because you see the pilot and the co-pilot, they were too busy flying on the other plane in order to, you never bothered to look at the ground, but he couldn't identify any of them. So we've seen very little of the ground, excepting on takeoff and landing and things like that.
Chapter 16, German Fighter Attacks.
They were a little bit scary with the idea that we wanted to stay in the group as much as possible, and that way they didn't bother you too much, and they were really pretty afraid towards the end when I was over there. I ended up the war without completing my 50 missions that I was supposed to get. I only got 34. But the Germans were a lot less than what they were earlier.
Chapter 17, The Very Pistol Rocket Attack.
Now, each airplane had a very pistol on it, and it opened up like a shotgun. The shell was 1.5 inches by 4 inches long. It had 3 balls in it like Roman candle, and they were different colors because each day we had a different set of colors. The problem was that if a ship challenged you or another airplane challenged you, you'd better shoot the correct set of balls up, otherwise they'd shoot you down. Because the Germans had captured some of our airplanes and fixed them up enough so that they could get them up. And they'd get our altitude, and of course then the anti-aircraft guns were very accurate. It was very imperative that these things, there was a socket in the top of the ship that you could turn them and lock them in and fire them. But one day, a friend of mine, a co-pilot, very good-sized guy, he didn't like the idea of the German fighters shooting at him, and he only had his .45 to shoot back. Well, it didn't seem like much, so he grabbed the very pistol, pulled back his window, and holding it in both hands, he'd fired at the German pilots, and of course that thing had a terrible kick. But that night when we got back, they debriefed us, and they said, "Say, what's this that the German pilots are complaining that the B-17s are shooting rockets at them?" Oh, we'll tell them, no, that was just Pete and his very pistol. But he did scare a lot of German pilots, and I wouldn't blame him for being scared if you've seen 3 colored balls coming at you, and what is it? But it was sort of a little humor along the way.
Chapter 18, A Friend's Ironic Turn of Events.
So one of my buddies went to work, and he lost an engine like I did, and he says he wasn't going to throw his bombs away. So he called his navigator, and he says, "Plot us a course for the nearest and the best rail yard you can find," which he did. And he dropped his bombs, and then he went back and he reported in and told them what he'd done, and they arrested him because he'd bombed an unauthorized target. Well, his guardian angel was sitting on his shoulder that day because he was the one ship in the squadron that had the camera aboard, and they recorded the bomb strikes in this rail yard. So the next day they sent up a recon plane to re-photograph the area, and they found out that there was 3 troop trains in that rail yard, and that he'd put several thousand guys out of action with his bombing. So they called him in, and they dropped the charges, and they gave him the Silver Star Medal instead. So that's why I say the war was fickle. You just didn't know when you were right or wrong sometimes.
Chapter 19, B-17 Flying Fortress Battle Damage Stories.
We had gone to work, and we had bombed our target after 2 or 3 tries. In other words, we went to one target and it was covered over, so we went to the second target. Finally, the third target, Vienna, we bombed. And we were on our way home, and I was flying co-pilot because we were in the lead airplane, and the other pilot was doing the flying, and I was trying to get some decent shots of flak with my camera. One of the guys had come up with a roll of color film, and he wanted $30 for it. Well, I bought it, and it was a good investment, I guess, because the last shot on the roll, I got a picture of this airplane. I seen it get hit. It tore the whole waist out of it, and I really expected him to fold. But we were over an area where they killed you if you went down, and so when he called and asked me how bad he was hit, I told him to stay with it as long as he could, because it was the consequences were too bad. And he managed to fly it 400 miles back and land it without breaking the tail off, believe it or not. Only one guy was killed. You can imagine the other waist gunner that was about 6 feet away from him. I don't think he could hear much after that for a while, but he survived. And as you can see in the picture, eventually but that airplane was very, very strong. We had one of them bring one back one day with 600 holes in it. And surprising enough, none of the guys were killed in the airplane. But the radio operator had turned around in his chair to get another receiver out of the rack and behind him, and his table was blown away. But they managed to get behind our lines and landed, and they had never bothered to do anything with it. It was just riddled completely. We had another guy bring one back with an engine and a half. Now, how do you get a half an engine out of it? The bomb blew off the top jug of one of the engines, and it broke the crankshaft, or the connecting rod right next to the crankshaft. And he lost 2 other engines, and so by letting down, he managed to keep this engine running at about half speed. And that just gave him enough to stay and get in behind the lines.
Chapter 20, Raid on Ploiești, Romania.
Now, Ploiești was a long trip to start with, and the fires were up around 25,000 feet when we got there. And we went in at 32,000 feet. And with the updraft of the fires, it pushed us up several thousand feet. I don't know exactly what. We didn't have time to even think. But now you think with the fires that high and that hot that we would have problems with the gasoline in our airplanes. But at 32,000 feet, it was 55 degrees below zero. And of course, it was 55 degrees below zero in the airplane because we had no heat in there. The only heat we had was in electric suits, and then we had sheepskin boots and jackets and the whole works. So we could keep fairly warm as long as nothing shorted out. If something shorted out, you got mighty cold. But it worked good. And the Ploiești oil fields, they didn't like us. We thought we were a nice bunch of guys. But somehow or another, they had a different opinion, and they shot flak up to it was like walking on it. The old saying is they threw the kitchen sink. Well, I didn't see one go by, but it was pretty bad. And I was glad that I didn't have too many trips over the Ploiești oil field. But we cut the production of oil to the German machine considerably because Romania had an awful lot of their oil.
Chapter 21, Luftwaffe Morale and Plywood Propellers.
The Germans, if a pilot there told his superiors that he didn't want to fly, they just took him out and shot him. And of course, that was psychological. So the rest of the pilots figured, well, hey, if I'm going to get shot, I might just as well fly and get shot. And so this is what happened. But in northern Italy, when the pilot came in and surrendered rather than get shot down, and had this FW-190, and I was sent up there to pick up a crew that had crashed in the Alps. And I seen this FW-190 sitting alongside the bone pile. So I asked about it, and they said, well, this guy had brought it in, and they'd phoned it around until it acted up, and then they pulled it in the bone pile. And I went over to look at it, and I put my hand on the propeller. It was a beautiful propeller, and hey, there was something wrong with it because instead of being scalding hot, being out in the sun, it was sort of cool. I looked at it, and here it was made out of plywood. And so I knew right away that, hey, the guys back at the base wouldn't believe one word if I told them the Germans were flying fighter airplanes with a plywood prop. So I took my penknife out and I managed to carve a small piece out of it and brought it back to prove it, and I got it so that you can see it. But I know I wouldn't want to fly a plane with a plywood prop. It just doesn't mesh very good.
Chapter 22, Accidents.
I was standing on the ground one day, and I seen these two P-38s, and they were probably a half a mile to a mile away from me, and several thousand feet probably, or whatever. Well, maybe not that high, but I looked at them and I thought, you know, those guys look like they're going to collide. But, you know, from the ground, you could have 1,000 feet between the planes and still, so I didn't think much about it until all of a sudden the two of them hit in one great big massive ball of fire. And one parachute came out, but of course he was dead because the P-38s had a tail fin cross between the two. And unless you tipped it upside down and bailed out, usually that cut the guy that bailed out. So it was not a good situation. But I remember that very much.
Chapter 23, Superstitions.
If you asked an airman if he was superstitious. They'd say, no, I'm not superstitious. But there were certain things that they wouldn't do because they were considered taboo. One of the things that was considered taboo was to turn around from the first mission that you went on. Well, on the first 5 missions, they would send a veteran pilot with the crew to make sure that you never know how people are going to react when they get under fire. And so going down the runway, our inverter burned out, and that meant that we had no superchargers. Well, with no superchargers, we didn't have hardly enough power to get off the ground, but we managed to mush off the ground. And I still, to this day, can see that plowed field at the end of the runway that I figured was going to be mine. But we managed to get airborne and stay airborne. And then, of course, they changed. We had a spare inverter, and they installed that, and then we were normal flying again. But we had no spare in case it happened again. And so I called the tower and I told them the situation, and they said, well, you got 2 choices. One, you can go out and dump your bombs in the Adriatic and come back, or 2, you can go on to the target and take your chances. So I called the crew one by one and asked them what their vote was, and to a man they all said, we'll go to the target rather than take a chance of getting in trouble with the taboo. So that's why they say they weren't superstitious, but they were.
Our tail gunner, Smilin Sandy Sanchez.
Well, when we were in training, our tail gunner slashed his wrists one night. And so one of the other guys saw him waving his hands in the moonlight. It was lights out. And he went over and he thought he was going to talk to him, and here he had blood all over his hands. Well, they took him off our crew. And Sandy had been over in England and had gone through 2 tours of duty. Now, this is about all we were told when they assigned him to our crew. But Sandy had almost every medal except the medal, the Congressional Medal of Honor. He had quite a number of medals, and I'd have to read the thing in order. But he was one of the nicest guys, and he earned a nickname of Smilin Sammy Sanchez, because he was always smiling. He wouldn't talk about his experiences in England. He had got into a runaway airplane and managed to stop it before it crashed into a hangar full of planes and guys working on them. And just one of the things, and he got into the pilot's seat when the pilot was killed and helped the co-pilot bring the airplane back. The co-pilot had been injured also, and so Sandy had really brought the airplane back. And unfortunately, Sandy had a very dislike for the Germans and the fighters. He had, I forget how many airplanes he had to his credit, but he had shot down a lot of airplanes. And he would volunteer for any mission. If somebody come up short of an engineer, he also was was actually an engineer or any other position, he would volunteer to go with them and take the guy's place if the guy was sick or something. And so then he had 44 missions in England, and at a time when they say only about 20% came back from one tour, let alone 2 tours. But he had 44 there, and he added another 22. And that was about 2 tours of duty, when only 20% of the guys come back from one. He come back to the States, and he'd spent 6 weeks here, and then he didn't like the way things are going in the States as far as discipline and so on, so he volunteered to go back with us, and they took the tail gunner's position. And he wouldn't talk about his missions in England. He was a very happy-go-lucky guy. He was always volunteering for anything that was going, and I didn't have as many missions as some of the others on my crew, and so he asked me if he could be my engineer, when I had my own crew, and I told him sure. But on about a month before the war ended, he was killed over there. They say that he, the other crew members bailed out, and most of them survived. But they said Sandy was still in the airplane shooting at the German planes that were shooting at to tear his plane down, and he was killed over there. They've never been able to find his body because it was moved several times. The Germans did show his dog tags to the survivors, and unfortunately, see, our deal was that they were supposed to leave one dog tag with the body, but evidently they took both dog tags off. And so they've tried to recover his body but couldn't. They did find the tail section of the airplane. It was nailed up to cover a hole in a barn over there, and the guy donated it to him. They have got it in a museum in Joliet, Illinois, where they have a display of all of his medals and paraphernalia. They also named a ballpark after him, and he was one terrific guy.
Smilin Sandy Sanchez's volunteer spirit.
If it was a engineer or any of the gunners, why he'd volunteer to take their place. There was always somebody getting sick or hurt or something, and so that's why he was picking up missions faster than the rest of us. Somehow or another, volunteering wasn't always the best thing.
Smilin Sandy's B-17 namesake.
When he was in England, they named one airplane after him and put a caricature of him on the side of the airplane, Smilin Sammy Sanchez. And this is the only enlisted man they ever knew that had an airplane named after him. There's pictures in nose art books that show him, and also some of the USO girls that were there when they dedicated the plane to him. And so he was a real hero, but he wouldn't admit it.
Smilin Sandy's personality.
He was a very, very happy-go-lucky guy, on the surface at least. To know him was, he was a friend. And of course our crew, we flew as a crew as much as we could. And so we were like a family. We had an entirely different situation in some of the other squadrons where they wouldn't let the crew members fly together because they were afraid when somebody got killed that the others would take it too hard. So this is it was a different situation.
Writing Sandy's missing in action letter.
Yeah, this was the hardest letter I ever had to write, was to write to Sandy's grandmother and tell her that I did not know whether he'd been killed or not, because there was 2 planes that had to break formation and both went down, and they seen one of them explode, but they didn't know which one it was. And that was the hardest letter I ever had to write, was tell her that I did not know what to say, and so I was glad I didn't have to write more than one. We all came back, excepting Sandy.
Chapter 25, Favorite Memories as a B-17 pilot.
The airplane was so forgiving and so strong, it was a real pleasure to know that we had it, because we had a lot less worries that way than the others. And I guess one of the outstanding things outside of that was when I brought gasoline to the partisans. They called me in and they asked if I would volunteer to fly gasoline to the partisans in Yugoslavia. And well, okay, one job isn't the same as the next, and I said, sure, that's no problem. And so they gave me a navigator that was briefed on a cow pasture, and I mean a real cow pasture. Back in the hills, there was trees on both sides of the cow pasture, and the cows had been taken out, thank goodness. But then I was given a co-pilot and an engineer. They filled the rest of the airplane with 5-gallon cans of gasoline. I'm sorry that I never asked how many they got in there, but we were loaded, and if the Germans would have caught us, we'd have been one big Roman candle. But I landed, and it was rough because nothing had been smoothed over. And then after I got stopped, just kept the engines running, and the partisans come running out from both sides of the cow pasture, and they unloaded the airplane in about 15-20 minutes. But their intelligence in that underground was superb, because they had an Army nurse that they brought out, one of our girls, and she wanted to ride back to Foggia, and she asked me if she could go along, and I said, well, I would really love to take you, but you know, we only checked out 4 parachutes. Well, she says, I'll go anyway. She said, I need to get back to my outfit. And she said, I'll go without a parachute. Well, I couldn't have that. It just went against the grain, so I gave her my parachute, because you know how it is. If you're driving a car, you're more confident. And of course, it was my responsibility if I was going to take her back. And I never really got a chance to talk to her, but because the cockpit is so noisy, that this is the reason that big service are pretty hard of hearing nowadays. But everything went along fine, and we got out. And this is the reason that I have a kind of a different feeling. To see, the partisans in our case were the Serbs, while they helped between the French on the ground and the Yugoslavians. They got about almost 6,000 of our guys back to their outfits. And they'd hide the people and loads of hay in the cellars or anything. And of course, if they got caught, they were shot, you know. But they went out of their way to help us. So this is the reason that I was more than willing to help them. Now the Albanians stuck up for Hitler, so if you got captured by one of them, why, you were going to a concentration camp of some sort. And so that was a very good thing.
Chapter 26, The Wedding of Dwight and Vilma.
When I was in cadets, in primary, I been going together with my wife for a couple of years. And we decided we'd like to get married. And so I went to the major and I told him that I'd like to get married. And he said, well, can she take care of herself and so on in case something happens to you? And I said, yeah. And so after a bunch of questions, he said, okay. So I asked him, I said, sir, is there a possibility of getting an overnight pass for Saturday night to Sunday morning? Well, he says, what time are you getting married? I said, 7 o'clock in the evening. Oh, he says, you don't have to be until 11, that's plenty of time. Well, you know, I didn't think so. And I was sputtering to one of my buddies about it. He said, well, didn't you hear the major took one of the airplanes and flew up to Amarillo to see his girlfriend for the weekend? And he said, why don't you go to his assistant? So, okay, anything, you know, I went to his assistant, who was a lowly second lieutenant, and explained my situation. And he says, you know, he says, I agree with you very much, but he says, boy, if you don't get back in the morning to fly, he says, it won't only be you, but he said, there'll be me too. Well, I convinced him. And you know how it is in a small town. Everybody knows everybody's business. And this was no different. It was a very small town in Ballinger, Texas. And she was living in a little apartment building. And all the people in there found out that I had to be back at 7 o'clock the next morning, on Sunday morning. So they came and knocked at the door and brought us 2 Big Ben alarm clocks with the double bells. They were very loud in themselves. And they brought 2 big dishpans, which they turned upside down and put one alarm clock on top of each one. And we had enough to wake up the whole town. So I got back the next morning and managed on the roll call and everything. And afterwards, my instructor, who had 6 cadets, took a look at me and, Oh, he says, you 5 guys, take those 5 airplanes out there and go orient yourself on your problems. And he says, I'm going with Dwight and make sure he gets back today. So that was our wedding night, but it held on because we had 56 plus years before she died.
After his service in the Army Air Corps, Dwight went on to enjoy a long and successful business in commercial photography. Since his retirement, he's been an active member of the Minnesota chapter of the 8th Air Force Historical Society.